South Island midden is an incredibly important site. Both the extraordinary long history of it, just over 6,000 years of Dingaan history, but it's also the pottery in there, which is unbelievably important in terms of our understanding of the history of Aboriginal people in all Australia, really. Because of the importance of the site, it's worthwhile really investing in the way that we record the site. We've got to really think about how we're going to present those results to other archaeologists in the outside world, because there will be a lot of scrutiny of this site because the results are so important. And certainly being part of the Centre of Excellence, the bar is raised very high. It's not going to be mediocre archaeology, it's going to be absolute cutting edge from a scientific point of view. And one of the expressions of that is the extraordinary detail we've gone in drawing the sections. So the way we do that is I've got to hop in the hole. I've got to get used to sort of spending days and days in this very confined space. Every shell, they measure down with a plumb bob at that point, first point on the shell, and they measure down, and I put the end of the tape measure on that little point of the shell, and then they read off on the string line and they tell me how many centimetres in depth it is. So then on the graph paper I put those two measurements together and I put a dot. I go, okay, that's the tip of that shell. Now I want to get the end of the shell, so we repeat the whole process. Dot. I do another point on the shell, plumb bob, and dot. And I look at the shell and then I sort of fill in and I do the drawing and I go, okay, there's one shell. And 10 days later, probably how many thousands of shells later, suddenly you have 3 big pieces of A3 graph paper that are covered with all these very sort of intricate sort of patterns of shell with all the different layers of the site. It's a lot of work. So, but this is a very important site, and it's extremely complicated. I mean, this is the most complex midden site I've ever excavated in terms of the density and the variety, but also the importance of the artefacts. You only get one go at this, so it's incumbent upon us to do it properly. Certainly owe that to the Aboriginal community to make sure we get it right, get the story right about the site. So we'll take this back and we'll scan it all in, put it into Illustrator and we'll start digitising it. Going around, well, thousands of points is going around each little thing, each little shell. For an outsider, you must just sort of go, that guy's mad. I mean, how can you spend days on end just down in that pit doing it? But I get into the zone and I'm an archaeologist. I love doing this sort of stuff. I mean, this is what I do. I mean, I'm staring at like over 6,000 years of history here. I mean, it's right in front of my face. It goes from my knees well above my head. I mean, how many hundreds of generations is literally, sort of embedded in this deposit here with all these shells? I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. So it's worth doing, even if it kills my back. It's like a living architecture, because it keeps building all the time, and it just reinforces every time I go there that we are a marine people. Here's the thousands of meals of our ancestors that's still here. We're surrounded by it. So clearly, these are not just like a pile of rubbish. There is something else going on here. These have deep sort of symbolic value. Right? I actually don't like people calling shell middens rubbish, even though that's what the textbooks say. I don't think it is rubbish. But what interests me is that how they incrementally sort of built up through time. They're always a work in progress, these sites. Just like this culture, society continually unfolds and every generation has to reproduce their world. I think these sites that we excavate are running in parallel and a part of that sort of constant unfolding of culture. There's a lot more to these sites than just piles of different remains. A lot. The number one thing that archaeologists should be trying to do is provide insights into what was the world like for the people whose culture they were excavating. 1996, I had an opportunity to go to Torres Strait for the first time. knowing very little about Torres Strait Islanders and their culture and history. I guess I went up there with very sort of traditional views of what coastal archaeology was about. Torres Strait Islanders didn't make pottery much. We know that from the oral histories, but also know that from the 2,500 acres of the Alfred Haver's work. He said there is no pottery traditions in Torres Strait, just like the rest of Australia. But then we did excavations and we found pottery. First of all, Torres Strait, then we did work in southern PNG, and then we found pottery that dated to around the same time period, a little bit earlier. There are these pottery making people who are referred to as Lapita peoples, who we thought only went out into the Pacific, starting around 3,500 years ago. And clearly there was another group of Lapita people that came over along the south coast of PNG, coming our way, coming towards Australia. Then we had the opportunity to come to Lizard Island, which is now we're coming 600 kilometres south of Torres Strait. We know from oral histories in Torres Strait that some Torres Strait Islander communities, they used to come down as far as Lizard Island. Through the extraordinary work of Matt Felgate, who's a Pacific archaeologist, who found some interesting pottery in the Solomons and thought it may actually show connections to the Queensland coast because of the minerals. And Matt came here and actually just wandered around and found some pottery in the intertidal zone. Absolutely amazing discovery. So we went up to him, Matt, we'd like to help. We've got resources, let's keep this story going, let's keep this project going. So Matt introduced us to the community elders that he'd been dealing with, and we all sat down and chatted and spoke about maybe could we develop a new sort of project to carry this initial work of Matt's forward, and everybody was right on board with it, thought it was a great idea. Then we were shown a midden on South Island, and we thought it was a phenomenal midden deposit. There's a lot of shell there. We started doing an excavation, and we got down sort of around sort of 60 centimetres or so, and there it started popping out amongst the shells, pieces of pottery. Absolutely amazing. Oh, wow, we found it. So given it was buried in those different layers of shell, now we can radiocarbon date it, now we can work out how old it is. There's something going on in the deep past here, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, of some sort of pottery tradition that links up PNG through Torres Strait, coming down the east coast of Queensland. The pottery is telling us that. We've got pottery 2,000 to 3,000 up in PNG, we've got pottery 2,000 to 3,000 in Torres Strait, and now we've got this pottery that looks like it may be. And this is where I sort of developed this notion of the coral sea cultural interaction sphere. Because in the past people have talked about sort of diffusion of cultural traits, but it was always seen as a one-way sort of movement. It's like nothing going north. Anthropologically, that doesn't make sense. When peoples interact, they interact. I mean, if they've got trade and exchange systems, by definition, things are going one way and things are going back the other way. That's how people interact. So really, to understand like the culture in any particular area there, we have to understand the whole sort of dynamics of the interaction sphere. We have to have a holistic understanding of the archaeology. But the centre of excellence, this is one of the questions that can now sort of zoom in on and try and get an understanding of Australia's interconnection with a broader world, and how Indigenous communities here had, in a sense, their own sort of globalisation, where they interconnected over thousands of kilometres with neighbouring peoples outside of Australia. So there's a lot more work to be done. Because really, that 600 kilometre coastline between here and Torres Strait, there's hardly any excavations being done. What else is out there? What other islands have pottery on them? What does it look like? How old is it? We don't know. So it's early days.